Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we ride north into the cold valley of a river called the Ticinus, where a boy of barely 17 is about to gallop straight into the worst mistake of his life, or the making of a legend, and even now, more than 2,000 years later, we still are not entirely sure which. The plain is grey with river mist. Horses stamp and snort clouds of breath into the morning air. Somewhere out there, hidden in the fog, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal is doing the thing he does better than any man alive, which is to appear exactly where you least want him to be. And here is your cheerful little reality check for the evening if you had been standing in that Roman cavalry line shield slick with mist, listening to hooves you could hear, but not yet see. You almost certainly would not have lived to tell anyone about it. Most of them did not. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight, your city, your little corner of the world, and what the clock says on your wall right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel in the dark. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The boy's name is Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he shares that name entirely with his father, which tells you a great deal about the family he was born into. In Rome, a name like that is not just a name, it is a debt. The Cornelii Scipiones have given consuls and generals to the Republic for generations, and every one of them carries the quiet, crushing expectation that he will do the same or die trying. Tonight, both of those options are very much on the table. His father, the consul, sits somewhere ahead in the murk at the head of the cavalry and the light infantry, and he has made a decision that history will not be kind to. He has ridden out to see for himself whether this Carthaginian rumour, this Hannibal, this man who supposedly dragged war elephants over the frozen spine of the Alps, is truly here in Italy, or merely a story frightening the countryside. The elephants, by the way, are real, though most of them died in the snow, and the survivors are miserable, half-starved, and about as fond of the Italian winter as you would be. Hannibal has perhaps a single elephant left that anyone can ride. And he rides it not out of grandeur, but because he has lost the sight in one eye to an infection and cannot easily walk. Keep that detail in your pocket. The greatest cavalry mind of the ancient world is at this very moment half-blind and swaying on the back of the last elephant in Italy. The consul learns the truth the hard way. The fog peels back, and there they are, the Numidian horsemen, lean and fast and utterly without mercy, sweeping wide around the Roman flanks the way water finds the low ground. You have to understand what these riders are. They wear almost no armour. They carry no reins, guiding their horses with the pressure of their knees and a single rope, and they fling javelins and wheel away before you can even lift your shield to answer. Fighting them is like trying to punch smoke. The Roman line does not so much break as dissolve, and in the middle of that dissolving the consul goes down. A javelin or a spear or the crush of a falling horse. The accounts do not entirely agree, but the result is the same. The father lies bleeding in the churned mud, ringed by enemies, and the men around him are already doing the very human thing of choosing their own survival over his. This is the moment. This is the hinge on which everything that follows tonight will turn. Because up on the slope, the 17-year-old sees his father fall. Now here, historians raise a hand and ask us to slow down because there are two versions of what happens next, and both were written by serious men. In one, the boy simply charges alone, screaming, spurring his horse down into the swarm of enemies, with the reckless certainty of someone too young to properly imagine his own death, and by sheer shock and momentum, he cuts a path to his father, hauls the wounded man up, and drags him clear. In the other version, whispered by a rival historian, it was not the boy at all, but a slave, a Ligurian, who did the rescuing, and the family later polished the story to hand the glory to their golden son. We will never know for certain, but even the skeptical Romans of later years chose to believe the boy did it. And I will let you decide tonight what that choice tells you about the kind of legend Rome needed him to be. Picture it either way. The mist, the blood cooling in the cold, the father's arms slung over the son's shoulders, the two of them staggering back toward the shattered remains of the Roman line, while the Numidians circle like wolves, deciding whether the meal is worth the trouble. They make it. Barely. And the boy who rides out of that valley is not the same boy who rode into it, because he has seen something no lecture in the forum could ever teach him. He has seen Roman courage fail. He has watched the finest cavalry of the Republic come apart against a shadow, and he has looked, however briefly, upon the mind that unmade them. He does not yet know it, but he has just met the man he will chase for the next 16 years across 3 countries and 2 continents. And the truly frightening part, the part he cannot possibly imagine as he binds his father's wounds by firelight that night, is that Ticinus was not the disaster. Ticinus was the warning. The real catastrophe is still coming, and it has a name that Romans will not be able to say aloud for 100 years without flinching. That name is Cannae, and to understand why it still makes historians shudder, you have to sit with the arithmetic of it, though I promise to keep the arithmetic gentle. 2 summers after Ticinus, the young Scipio, is older now, perhaps 19 or 20, and he has been given the rank of military tribune, an officer's post, in the largest army Rome has ever assembled, 80,000 men. Give or take, gather on the plain of Cannae in the heel of Italy, and they have gathered for one purpose, to finally crush this Hannibal by the simple weight of numbers. It is the biggest hammer Rome can swing, and here is what you have to understand. Hannibal is about to catch that hammer, turn it in the air, and drive it straight back into the men who threw it. The morning is hot, and the wind is worse. It blows out of the south, that dry, gritty wind that carries the dust of the plain into your eyes and your teeth, and Hannibal, who notices everything, has arranged his army so that the wind blows the dust into Roman faces and away from his own. Small thing, deadly thing. Scipio, somewhere in the ranks, tastes that grit, and does not yet know it is a signal that the man across the field has already thought of details his own commanders never will. You know the shape of what happens even if you have never heard the name, because every military academy on earth still teaches it. Hannibal thins his centre deliberately and lets it bulge forward toward the Romans, an inviting soft belly. The legions press into it, sensing a breakthrough, shoving deeper and deeper, drunk on the feeling of winning. And then the belly does not break. It bends. It folds backward like a drawn bow. And while the Romans pour into that curving pocket, Hannibal's heavy African infantry close in from both sides, and his cavalry, having smashed the Roman horse, comes thundering around the rear to seal the bag shut. The largest army in Roman history is now standing inside a box made of enemies, packed so tightly that men in the middle cannot lift their arms to fight. They can only stand and wait and die. I am going to spare you the full picture, because it is a bedtime story and not a nightmare. But I will give you one image that survived the day, because it tells you everything about the horror of being trapped in that crush. In the years after farmers ploughing, that field would still turn up the bones, and Roman writers spoke of soldiers found the next morning who had dug little holes in the earth with their bare hands and pressed their faces into the dirt, deliberately smothering themselves, choosing their own quiet ending over waiting for the enemy to reach them. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans die in a single afternoon. It remains to this day one of the bloodiest days of combat the human species has ever recorded, and it was all done with iron and muscle face to face in the space of a few hours. And here at last, out of that box of death, our young man cuts his way free. We do not know exactly how Scipio survives when so many do not. He is young, he is strong, he is on a horse, and perhaps he is simply lucky in the way that legends always seem to be lucky right up until the moment they are not. But survive he does, and he gathers a small band of shattered, bloodied fugitives around him and rides through the falling dark toward the nearest walls, the town of Canusium, where the scraps of the army are trying to remember how to breathe. What he finds there is almost worse than the battlefield. He finds despair. Not the loud, panicked kind, but the quiet, seductive, reasonable kind, and it is being spoken aloud by the sons of Rome's finest families. Huddled in a house in Canusium, a group of these young nobles have reached a very sensible-sounding conclusion. Rome, they say, is finished. The Republic is broken beyond saving. And so the smart move, the survivors' move, is to gather what money and men they can take ship, abandon Italy, and go sell their swords to some foreign king who still has a future. They are not cowards exactly. They are simply doing the math, and the math says Rome is dead. Scipio hears this, and something in him goes very cold and very clear. Picture the scene, because it is one of the great scenes in Roman memory. He does not argue. He does not give a speech about honor, not yet. He draws his sword, still crusted from the day's work, and he walks into that room of frightened aristocrats, and he holds the naked blade over their heads, and he tells them in effect that any man who does not swear this instant on his life, never to abandon the Republic of Rome, will die right here, right now, on this floor at his hand. He makes them repeat the oath one by one at sword's point, this boy who watched an entire nation die that afternoon and decided alone in the dark that it would not be allowed to. And they swear, every one of them. Whether from shame or genuine conviction or simple terror of the young man with the very steady sword, they take the oath and they stay. It is a small moment in the grand catastrophe of Cannae. A room, a handful of men, one drawn blade. But I want you to hold on to it tonight, because in that room you can already see the whole shape of the man he will become. Not the greatest tactician, perhaps. Hannibal will always be that. But something Rome needs even more in this hour, a man who simply refuses to lose, who looks at total defeat and treats it as a temporary inconvenience. He does not know yet that the price of that refusal will be everything. He does not know that his own father, far away across the sea in Spain, is fighting a war that is about to swallow the Scipio family whole. And that news, when it comes, will nearly break the boy who could not be broken at Cannae. To understand the blow that is coming, you have to look away from Italy for a while, across the water to Spain, because Spain is where this war is secretly being decided, and almost nobody in Rome is paying it the attention it deserves. Remember Scipio's father, the wounded consul from the misty river at Ticinus. He did not stay home to recover in a comfortable villa. He and his brother, Scipio's uncle Gnaeus, took command in Spain, and for years the two brothers have been doing something quietly remarkable. They have been keeping Hannibal starved. Here is what you have to understand about this war, the thing that Cannae's blood and thunder can make you forget. Hannibal is loose in Italy, unbeaten, terrifying, but he is also alone. He is a general without a country attached to him, cut off from home by the sea and by hostile territory. Everything he needs, fresh soldiers, silver elephants, orders from Carthage, has to travel up through Spain and across southern Gaul to reach him. Spain is the pipeline. Spain is the artery. And for years the two Scipio brothers have had their hands clamped around that artery, pinching it shut, bleeding the reinforcements that should have been flowing to Hannibal. It is unglamorous work. No poet sings of it, but it may be the single greatest reason Hannibal, for all his genius, can never quite deliver the final killing blow to Rome. His brother Hasdrubal keeps trying to march an army through to help him, and the Scipio brothers keep stopping him year after grinding year. And then in a single terrible stretch of days it all comes apart. The brothers make a decision that looks bold and turns out to be fatal. They split their army in two to cover more ground and strike at the enemy from multiple directions. On paper it is aggressive, confident, the sort of thing that wins wars. In reality, it hands their enemies the one thing they have been praying for, which is the chance to face each Scipio separately instead of together. And the Carthaginians have another card to play, a quieter and nastier one. Much of the Scipio armies is made up of Spanish tribal warriors, Celtiberians, fierce fighters, but loyal to whoever pays them best that season. The Carthaginians simply pay them better, or perhaps they whisper the right promises. Either way, in the crucial hour, thousands of these mercenaries melt away into the hills and leave the Roman brothers standing nearly alone against the gathering storm. Uncle Gnaeus goes first, or the father does. The accounts disagree on the order, but the pattern is the same, and it is merciless. One brother is surrounded by overwhelming numbers, his abandoned position swarmed, and he dies fighting in a hopeless little knot of loyal men. And here is the cruelest turn of the knife. The two disasters happen within about 4 weeks of each other, in the same region, to men who could not reach each other in time to help. One brother may have died not even knowing the other was already gone, or worse, knowing exactly what was coming and unable to stop it. In the space of a single lightning-quick month, both fathers of the Scipio name in Spain are killed, and everything they spent years building simply evaporates. Now, put yourself back in Rome for a moment, in the house where the young Scipio is living. He is in his early 20s. He has already survived 2 of the worst battles in his nation's history. He has held a sword over the heads of despairing nobles and forced them to swear loyalty to a republic that seemed doomed. And now a messenger arrives, dust-caked and grim, with the news that his father is dead, and his uncle, both of them, The two men who taught him everything, gone in the same breath on the far side of the sea, and their bodies lie somewhere on Spanish ground that Rome no longer even controls. I want you to sit in that silence with him for just a moment tonight, because history usually rushes past grief on its way to the next battle, and I think that is a small unkindness. This is a young man who has now lost in the span of a few short years almost every certainty a person can lose. His father, his mentor, the illusion that his nation was invincible. He is, by any reasonable measure, a man with every excuse in the world to step back, to mourn, to let older and steadier hands take up the burden. And this is precisely where the story turns from tragedy towards something stranger and more luminous, because Scipio does not do the reasonable thing. He almost never does. But before we get there, understand the full scope of the catastrophe, because Rome certainly did. With the brothers dead, the Roman position in Spain does not just weaken, it collapses. The survivors of the two armies flee north and cling to a thin strip of land above the great river, Ebro huddled behind it like men behind a fence with wolves on the other side. Everything south of that river, the mines, the ports, the silver, the loyal towns, the artery that fed or starved Hannibal, all of it falls back under Carthaginian control. Years of grinding, unglamorous, war-winning work undone. The pipeline reopens, and in Italy Hannibal must have felt the pressure ease, must have sensed that reinforcements might finally start to flow. Rome now faces a question with no good answer. Someone has to go to Spain and rebuild from ashes. Someone has to reclaim that collapsed frontier. And here is the terrible catch that we will open properly in a moment. Nobody wants the job. It is a graveyard command. It has already killed two of Rome's finest generals in a month. The men experienced enough to attempt it are precisely the men wise enough to refuse it, and so a strange, embarrassed silence settles over the Roman assembly whenever the question of Spain is raised. Into that silence, one young man is about to walk forward, and half of Rome is going to think he has lost his mind. The Roman assembly gathers on the field of Mars to choose a new commander for Spain, and the mood is not the eager, jostling ambition you might expect from a nation of men who love glory more than they love almost anything. The mood is closer to the silence in a room when someone asks for a volunteer to reach into a dark hole where a snake was last seen. Everyone studies their own sandals. The great men, the ones with the scars and the grey hair and the long lists of offices, held the ones who, by all rights, should be leaping at the chance to command an army, find sudden and pressing reasons to look elsewhere, because they have done the calculation, the same cold calculation those nobles did at Canusium, and the answer frightens them. Spain has just eaten 2 Scipios in a month. Spain is where reputations and men go to die. You have to understand how genuinely humiliating this moment is for Rome. This is a people who define themselves by courage, by the willingness to die for the Republic, and here they are, the flower of their aristocracy, unable to find a single senior candidate willing to take the command. The presiding magistrate calls for nominations and hears nothing but the wind off the field and the shuffling of embarrassed feet. It is the kind of silence that curdles into shame the longer it lasts. And then a young man steps up onto the raised ground, where all can see him, and offers himself for the command. And the silence changes its flavour entirely, because it is him. It is the Scipio boy, the one whose father and uncle are the very men Spain has just killed. He is somewhere around 25 years old, which is scandalously young for such a post. He has never held the higher offices that tradition demands as qualification for so great a command. By every rule of Roman propriety, he should not even be eligible, and everyone standing on that field knows it. For a heartbeat, the shame in the crowd transforms into something warmer, a rush of relief and admiration. Here is a young man offering to walk into the grave that swallowed his own family to avenge his father and uncle, to shoulder the burden the grizzled veterans were too wise or too frightened to lift. The crowd, being human, being Roman, being suckers for exactly this kind of gesture, roars its approval and gives him the command on the spot. And then the accounts tell us the roar dies down, and in the cooling quiet that follows, the same crowd begins quietly to have second thoughts. I love this detail because it is so deeply recognizably human. The moment of enthusiasm passes and reality sets in. They look at what they have just done, They have handed the most dangerous military command in the entire war, the command that will kill you as soon as look at you, to a grieving young man barely old enough for the job, chosen not through careful deliberation but in a wave of emotion, because his tragic family story made a lovely speech unnecessary. Men begin muttering to their neighbors, "Was that wise? Did we just send this boy to die the way his father died and lose the last of a great family and the war along with him?" The mood on the field of Mars sours from celebration into a kind of collective anxious regret, the feeling of a crowd that has just done something bold and is now wondering if bold was the same thing as foolish. Scipio feels the mood shift. Of course he does. He notices everything the way Hannibal notices everything, and this is where we get one of the first true glimpses of the peculiar genius that separates him from ordinary brave young men. He does not sulk at the sudden doubt. He does not deliver a defensive speech about his qualifications. Instead, he calls the people together again, and he gives a speech, and the speech is a masterpiece of a very specific kind. He speaks not about his youth or his family's ghosts, but with such serene, radiant confidence about the coming campaign, so completely without fear, that the crowd's anxiety simply evaporates in the warmth of his certainty. He talks not merely of avenging his father and uncle, but of finishing the entire war, of driving Carthage out of Spain forever. He speaks as a man who has already seen the victory and is simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. And here we brush against one of the great mysteries of Scipio, the thing that will follow him his whole life and that historians still turn over in their hands like a strange coin. Where does this confidence come from? Scipio, you see, cultivated a reputation for being touched by the divine. He was in the habit from his youth of going up to the temple on the Capitoline Hill and sitting alone in the quiet before making any great decision, and men whispered that he spoke there with the gods, that Jupiter himself guided the young man's steps. He never confirmed it. He never denied it either. And that, you have to understand, is the clever part. Whether Scipio truly believed himself divinely favored, or whether he simply understood centuries before anyone wrote a book on the subject that men will follow a leader who seems chosen by heaven, the effect was the same. His soldiers came to believe he could not lose, and an army that believes it cannot lose is a terrifying thing to face. So he sails for Spain, this young man wrapped in grief and confidence, in equal measure to a shattered frontier where his family's blood has soaked into the ground and a demoralized remnant of an army waits behind a river, expecting little and hoping for less. The veterans back in Rome watch him go, half convinced they have just thrown away the last Scipio. What none of them can imagine, what Scipio himself keeps locked behind that serene smile, is that he already has a plan, and it is so audacious, so precisely timed, so quietly insane that when he reveals it to his own officers, they will think briefly that grief has finally driven their young commander out of his mind. He arrives in Spain and does the thing a wise, cautious young commander is supposed to do, which is to spend the first winter doing almost nothing. He drills the shaken survivors. He reinforces them with the fresh troops he has brought. He listens. He sends out scouts and fishermen and traders and anyone else who will talk, and he gathers information the way a miser gathers coins quietly, obsessively telling no one what he intends to buy with it. The Carthaginians watching from the south see a young man being sensibly timid, licking the family wounds, and they relax. They have 3 separate armies in Spain, each commanded by a different general, and those 3 armies are scattered across the vast peninsula hundreds of miles apart, none of them expecting the boy to do anything at all this year. That is exactly the mistake Scipio has been waiting for, because while he has been playing the cautious student, he has been staring at a map and falling in love with a single target. The Carthaginians call it New Carthage, their great fortress city on the southern coast, and it is the beating heart of everything they hold in Spain. It is where they keep their war chest, their silver, their supplies, their war machines, their hostages, the treasury that funds the whole enterprise. It is the finest harbour on that coast. It is in every sense the key to Spain, and here is the piece of it that makes Scipio's eyes light up in the lamplight of his tent. Because the 3 Carthaginian armies are so scattered, not one of them is within 10 days' march of New Carthage. The most valuable city in the peninsula is sitting there, stuffed with treasure, guarded by a garrison of perhaps 1,000 real soldiers, and nobody is coming to help it. But you have to understand why nobody worries about New Carthage falling, why it can be left so lightly defended. It is a natural fortress and a devil to attack. It sits on a rocky peninsula that juts into the sea, ringed almost entirely by water. On one side, the harbour. On the other, a broad shallow lagoon. The only land approach is a narrow neck, easily defended, where a handful of men can hold off an army. To take it, you would need to besiege it for months, and the moment you sat down to besiege it, the 3 Carthaginian armies would come marching back and crush you against the walls. It is by every rule of ancient warfare not worth the attempt. Scipio decides to take it in a single day. He tells almost no one his true destination. He marches his army south at a punishing pace, and even his own officers believe they are heading somewhere else entirely, until the walls of New Carthage rise up before them, and the men realize with a jolt exactly how deep into enemy territory their young commander has led them. He has synchronized the march with his fleet, which arrives by sea at the same moment, so that the city wakes one morning to find itself suddenly ringed by land and water, both by an army nobody thought would come, led by a man everyone thought was still nursing his grief in the Felth. North. The assault begins, and at first it goes exactly as the rules predict. Scipio throws his men against that narrow land neck, and the fighting is savage, and the defenders, though few, have the enormous advantage of the walls and the choke point, and the Romans are hurled back, bloodied. It looks for a while like the folly the veterans in Rome predicted. But here is where you have to lean in close, because this is the part that made men whisper about the gods for the rest of Scipio's life. He had been talking, you see, to the local fishermen, and the fisherman had told him a curious thing about the great shallow lagoon on the city's northern side, the one everyone treated as an impassable moat. In the late afternoon, they said, the wind and the tide together pull the water out of the lagoon, and it drops sometimes until a man can wade across. Scipio waited for that hour, and when the assault on the land neck was at its bloody screaming height, drawing every defender to that side of the city, the tide in the lagoon began to fall exactly as the fisherman had promised. Scipio sent a picked band of men wading out into the sinking water shields high, and they crossed the lagoon that no one guarded, because no one believed it could be crossed, and they came up under the northern walls where the defenders were thinnest, where the wall was lowest, because who would ever attack from the water? They set their ladders, they climbed, and they were over the top and into the city before the garrison understood that the sea itself had betrayed them. Now Scipio, being Scipio, let his soldiers believe the god of the sea had drawn back the waters as a favour to Rome, and he never quite corrected the impression. The truth, of course, is that he had simply listened to some fishermen and understood the tides better than the men who had lived behind that lagoon for years. But which story would you rather your soldiers believed, going into the next battle? That their commander got a lucky tip, or that Neptune himself parts the waters for the young man Jupiter loves? He took the greatest prize in Spain in a single afternoon, and he wrapped the victory in the shimmer of the miraculous, and both of those things were exactly as he intended. Inside those walls now sat the treasury of Carthaginian Spain, mountains of silver, the war machines, and something more delicate and more dangerous than any of it. Hundreds of hostages, the wives and children of the Spanish chieftains held by Carthage to keep the tribes obedient. Every one of them was now Scipio's prisoner, to do with as he pleased. And what he chose to do with them would prove, in the long run, an even sharper weapon than the walls he had just stormed. Consider his position for a moment, because the temptation laid before him is enormous. Scipio now holds packed into the captured city the families of half the tribal chieftains of Spain. Wives, daughters, sons. The Carthaginians had gathered these hostages precisely because they understood the brutal arithmetic of loyalty in that fractured land, that a chieftain will keep his oaths so long as you hold his children behind stone walls, and will break them the instant you do not. Scipio has inherited this entire cruel machine intact. He could simply keep turning the same crank the Carthaginians turned. Hold the hostages, and the tribes must obey him now instead of Carthage. It is the obvious move. It is what everyone expects. He does something else, and it is so counterintuitive that it takes the breath away even now. He calls the hostages together, all these frightened women and children who have spent months or years as human collateral, and he tells them they are free to go home. He gathers the tribal envoys who have come to plead for their families, and he returns their wives and their children to them, unharmed, unransomed, with courtesy, and with gifts for the journey. He does not extract oaths at sword's point. He does not demand payment. He simply gives them back and lets the meaning of the gift arrive on its own. And here you have to understand the mind of the man, because this is not softness. Do not mistake it for softness. This is Scipio the calculator, the reader of tides and men, applying to human loyalty the same precise attention he applied to that lagoon. The Carthaginians bought obedience with fear, and fear, Scipio understood, is a currency that inspires only the minimum. A man ruled by fear for his family serves you exactly as much as he must, and not 1 inch more, and he watches always for the day he can break free. But a man whose family you have returned to him freely when you held every right to keep them, that man is bound to you by something fear can never buy. And gratitude, unlike fear, makes men fight for you rather than merely obey you. Scipio had just discovered that mercy deployed at exactly the right moment is a weapon that can conquer territory no sword can reach. The tribes began to come over to him, not all at once and not all of them, but they began to come chieftain after chieftain, drawn by the astonishing news of a Roman general who returned what he had captured. Some of these Spanish leaders started calling him by a title that ought to make you sit up because they hailed him as king. And this brings us to one of the most revealing small moments in the whole story, a moment that tells you Scipio understood not just Spain but Rome and the deadly jealousy that waited for him back home. When the Spanish chieftains acclaimed him as king, Scipio flatly refused the title. He told them, in effect, that they might think it the grandest name in the world, but that to a Roman it was the most hateful word there was. You have to understand what kingship meant in the Roman mind. Rome had thrown out its last king centuries before, and built its entire identity around the horror of one man ruling alone. To be called king in Rome was not an honor, it was an accusation, the surest way to get yourself killed by your own countrymen. Scipio, young as he was, already sensed the trap. He would take the loyalty of Spain gladly, but he would not take a word that could one day be carried back to the Senate and used to hang him. Hold that instinct in your mind, because years from now, the jealousy he is so carefully sidestepping here will finally catch up with him, and this same wariness will not be enough to save him. But it is another act of mercy from these days that Rome remembered longest, and it is the one that made grown Roman men who did not sentimentalize easily speak of Scipio with something close to awe. Among the captives brought to him was a young woman of extraordinary beauty, and his soldiers, knowing their commander was young and unmarried and victorious and entitled by every custom of war to take whatever he wished, brought her to him almost as a prize, expecting he would be pleased. Scipio looked at her and asked about her, and learned that she was betrothed to a young Celtiberian prince, that she was to be married, that there was a young man out there somewhere who loved her and had lost her to the war. And Scipio sent for that young prince. He returned the girl to him untouched, and when her family arrived with a great weight of gold to ransom her, Scipio refused the ransom and instead pressed the gold upon the young couple as a wedding gift. He asked only one thing in return, that the prince remember this and be a friend to Rome. The prince, whose name was Lucius, went home stunned, and he came back not long after, at the head of a force of his own warriors, to fight for the young Roman who had handed him back his bride and his gold together. I want you to notice what Scipio is building here, because it is the quiet engine underneath everything spectacular he does. He is not merely winning battles. He is manufacturing loyalty, deliberately, systematically, understanding that in the end a war is not won by the army you destroy, but by the country you convince to stand behind you. Every hostage returned, every act of restraint, is a stone laid in a foundation. And it is worth pausing tonight in the calm of your own safe room on how rare that kind of restraint truly is, how easy it would have been to be cruel, and how deliberately he chose not to be. But mercy does not win a war by itself, and Scipio knows it. Somewhere to the south, the 3 scattered Carthaginian armies have finally understood what this young man has done to them, and they are gathering. The eldest and most dangerous of the enemy generals is a man who shares a name with Hannibal's own brother, and he is marching now to teach the boy that charm is no substitute for steel. And Scipio is about to learn the bitter lesson that you can win a battle brilliantly, and still watch the thing you most wanted slip clean through your fingers. The enemy general marching toward him is Hasdrubal Barca, and that surname should send a small chill through you, because Barca is the family name of Hannibal himself. This is Hannibal's younger brother, and he carries in his blood the same restless, dangerous brilliance, and he carries in his heart a single, overriding purpose that makes him far more frightening to Rome than any ordinary general. Hasdrubal does not truly care about holding Spain. Spain to him is a road. What Hasdrubal wants, what he has wanted for years, is to gather an army in Spain and march it north over the mountains, over the Alps, down into Italy to join his brother Hannibal at last. Two Barca brothers united on Italian soil with two armies. That is the nightmare that keeps Roman senators awake at night. That is the union that could finally actually end Rome. So, when Scipio marches south and finds Hasdrubal's army camped on a hill near a town called Baecula, the stakes are not merely a battle. The stakes are whether that dreaded march to Italy can be stopped before it begins. Hasdrubal has chosen his ground with a professional's eye. He sits atop a plateau with steep broken slopes falling away on the sides, a natural fortress, the kind of position where a smaller force can shred a larger one that tries to climb up into it. It is once again exactly the sort of place the rulebook says you do not attack. And once again Scipio looks at the impossible ground and sees, instead of a wall, a door. He studies the plateau the way he studied the lagoon. He sees that Hasdrubal, confident in the strength of his position, has grown a little careless, has not fully occupied the high ground above and behind his own line, has left the approaches less guarded than a truly nervous man would. And Scipio devises an assault that breaks every convention. He sends light, fast troops straight up the steep front of the plateau to pin the Carthaginian outposts and fix their attention to make Hasdrubal look forward and down. And then, while the enemy's eyes are locked on that frontal fight, Scipio personally leads a large force in two wings around the flanks, scrambling up the broken slopes on either side, climbing where no one thought an army could climb, to come up onto the plateau from the sides and the rear all at once. It works. It works beautifully. The Roman wings crest the high ground and crash into the Carthaginian flanks before Hasdrubal can properly wheel his heavy troops to meet them. And the Carthaginian line, gripped from the front and struck from both sides, begins to come apart. By every measure of the battlefield, Scipio has won another brilliant victory, the second in a row against ground that should have been unassailable. His soldiers are exultant. They have beaten a Barca. They chant his name, and Scipio, standing amid his victorious army, watches the thing he actually came for escape. Because Hasdrubal, and here you must give the man his due, is nobody's fool. He has read the battle even faster than Scipio has won it. The moment he sees the Roman wings cresting the plateau, he understands the battle is lost, and he understands something else, something that separates the truly dangerous general from the merely brave one. He understands that his army is not the prize. His purpose is the prize. His war chest, and his elephants, and above all himself alive, still carrying the mission to reach his brother, those are what matter. So while his rear guard and his abandoned Spanish allies buy time by dying, Hasdrubal gathers his treasury, his elephants, and the core of his best troops, and he slips off the far side of the plateau and away, marching not to safety in the south, but north toward the mountains, north toward the road to Italy. He turns a crushing defeat into a controlled escape, sacrificing the disposable parts of his army to preserve the one part that could still lose Rome, the war. And Scipio cannot stop him. I want you to sit with the bitterness of that, because it is one of the sharpest ironies in the whole story. Scipio has just fought a near flawless battle. He has beaten Hannibal's brother on ground that should have been impossible. And it does not matter, because the one outcome he desperately needed, the destruction or capture of Hasdrubal himself, is the one outcome he did not achieve. He watches the dust of Hasdrubal's column recede toward the north, and he knows with a sick certainty that he has won everything except the only thing that counted. He could pursue, but to chase Hasdrubal north would mean abandoning Spain to the other two Carthaginian armies still at large, letting them reunite and rebuild behind him and trap him far from any support. He would win his prey and lose the peninsula. He cannot pay that price. So he lets his enemy go and turns back to finish the conquest of Spain, and carries the knowledge that he has, in a sense, failed inside his greatest success. Hasdrubal marches on. He crosses into Gaul, he winters there, gathering strength, and eventually he does the very thing Rome feared. He brings an army over the Alps and down into Italy, retracing his brother's terrible footsteps. And here, mercifully, is where a little grace enters the story, though it comes from other men's hands and not from Scipio's. Far away in Italy, at a river called the Metaurus, other Roman armies catch Hasdrubal before the two Barca brothers can join, and they destroy him and they kill him. And they do a thing so brutal it tells you exactly how terrified Rome had been of that reunion. They cut off Hasdrubal's head, carry it south and hurl it into Hannibal's camp, so that the great general learns of his brother's death by seeing his brother's face thrown at his feet in the dirt. Hannibal, they say, looked upon it and murmured that he now saw the doom of Carthage. The union that could have ended Rome was ended instead on a riverbank with a severed head. Scipio did not win that particular reprieve. But the war in Spain was not yet finished, and the last and greatest Carthaginian army there still stood between him and total victory. To break it, he would have to do something he had never done before. He would have to outgeneral them, not by surprise, not by tides or hidden slopes, but in the open, in broad daylight, in a fair fight that he intended to make spectacularly unfair. The last great reckoning in Spain comes at a place called Ilipa, and by now the Carthaginians have learned to fear the young man, which makes them careful, which makes them gather everything they have left into one enormous host. Somewhere around 70,000 men by the ancient counts, though you should always take those numbers with a pinch of salt, since ancient writers loved a round and terrifying figure the way we love a good headline. Whatever the true total it is, the largest army Carthage can still field in the peninsula, and it badly outnumbers the force Scipio brings against it. The two armies make camp on facing hills across a broad plain, and there they settle into a strange, tense ritual that goes on for days. Each morning, you see, after the sun has climbed and the men have breakfasted, the Carthaginian commander leads his army down out of camp and forms it up on the plain offering battle. And each day Scipio waits, lets them stand there a while, and then leads his own army down and forms up to face them, and the two hosts glare at each other across the field until evening, when both sides, by unspoken agreement, march back up to their camps without a blow struck. Day after day this happens, and Scipio, every single day, arranges his line the same way, with his best troops, his tough Roman and Italian legionaries in the centre, and his less reliable Spanish allies out on the wings. The Carthaginians see this pattern repeat morning after morning. They come to expect it. They stop really looking at it. And that precisely is what Scipio has been patiently teaching them to do. Because this is the trap, and it is a thing of quiet, beautiful cunning. Scipio has spent all those identical boring days training his enemy's expectations the way you might train a dog, so that on the morning he chooses, the enemy's own assumptions will destroy them. That morning, before the Carthaginians have even eaten, before the sun is properly up, Scipio strikes camp and forms his army and sends it forward, fed and ready in the grey light. His skirmishers and cavalry go racing across the plain to fall upon the Carthaginian outposts, and the enemy tumbles out of their tents in a panic, hungry, half-armed, rushing to form their line before the Romans are upon them. And in that frantic scramble, the Carthaginian commander does the one thing he has been conditioned to do. He forms up exactly as he has every previous day, assuming Scipio will do the same, placing his own best troops, his tough Africans, in his centre to face the Roman centre where the legionaries always stand. But this morning, Scipio has flipped his entire army. This morning, his weak Spanish allies stand in the centre, and his best Roman and Italian troops are massed out on the wings. The Carthaginians, in their hungry haste, have unknowingly lined up their strongest men to face Scipio's weakest, and their own weaker troops to face Scipio's very best. The trap is set, and the enemy has walked into it while still trying to buckle their armour. Now watch what Scipio does with the shape of the battle, because it is the mirror image of a horror we witnessed earlier tonight. He orders his centre, the weak Spanish troops, to advance slowly, deliberately holding back, keeping the strong African centre pinned in place, but never quite closing with them, dangling just out of reach. And he orders his powerful wings to swing outward and then wheel forward, fast curling around the ends of the Carthaginian line like two great arms closing. Do you feel the echo? At Cannae, Hannibal let his centre give way, and folded his wings inward to swallow the Romans whole. At Ilipa, Scipio does something like the reverse, refusing his centre and driving his wings around the flanks to shatter the enemy's edges and roll the whole army up from the outside in. The young man who survived the worst day in Roman history has studied the mind that inflicted it, and now he turns its own grammar back upon Carthage. The Roman wings smash the weak Carthaginian flanks and begin folding inward, and the enemy's strong centre, still pinned and unable to reach the retreating Spanish troops before them, finds itself being crushed from both sides. The great host, the largest Carthage had left in Spain, begins to collapse in on itself. And then heaven or weather delivers the final blow, and Scipio surely thanked whichever god the men believed in. A tremendous storm broke over the field sheets of rain, turning the plain to mud and forcing an end to the fighting before the Carthaginians could be entirely destroyed on the spot. They fled back to their camp, mauled and broken, and under cover of the storm and the night they tried to slip away entirely to retreat to safety. But the rain that saved them from annihilation now turned traitor, because the muddy ground and the pursuing Romans and the disintegrating loyalty of their own remaining Spanish allies turned the retreat into a rout, and the great army came, apart on the roads, hunted and scattered, until it simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. With that, the war in Spain was effectively over. The artery that Scipio's father and uncle had died trying to hold the pipeline that fed Hannibal was now clamped shut forever, this time in Roman hands. Carthage would never again draw strength from the silver and soldiers of Spain. The young man had done what he came to do and more, avenging his family and reclaiming a lost province and severing Hannibal from the wellspring of his power. But you have to understand the size of the ambition that had been growing inside Scipio through all of this, because winning Spain was never for him the true goal. Winning Spain was clearing the board. In his mind, a far bolder and more dangerous plan had been taking shape, a plan that most of Rome would consider reckless to the point of madness. He did not want to keep chasing Hannibal around Italy, where the great man had never once been beaten. He wanted to force Hannibal to come to him on ground of Scipio's choosing, and to do that he was going to have to sail to Africa itself, to strike at Carthage's own heart. But first, before any of that, he needed allies in a strange land. And to win them, he was about to do something so personally reckless that it would make the storming of New Carthage look cautious by comparison. To invade Africa, Scipio understood a thing that Rome, in its stubborn love of infantry, was slow to grasp. Carthage's true strength, the arm that had won at Cannae and haunted every field since, was cavalry. And the finest cavalry in the world came from the Numidians, those lean, reinless riders we watched swirl like smoke around his father at Ticinus. Whoever the Numidians rode for would very likely win the war. And Numidia at this moment was split between two rival kings who hated each other, which meant the whole African campaign might hinge not on a battle at all but on a courtship. Scipio needed to win at least one of these desert princes to his side, and he decided characteristically that the way to do it was to go and charm the man in person, in his own kingdom, with almost no protection at all. The first prince was Syphax, the more powerful of the two, a king with a large kingdom and a large army and a large opinion of himself. And Scipio's decision to visit him is one of those moments that make you put a hand to your forehead because it is so audacious it barely seems real. Scipio sailed from Spain to Africa with just 2 ships, a tiny, vulnerable little party, and put himself, the most valuable Roman alive, directly into the hands of a foreign king whose loyalties were entirely uncertain. And here fortune arranged a scene that no playwright would dare invent, because when Scipio arrived at the harbour, another set of ships was already there. Hasdrubal the Carthaginian, not Hannibal's brother this time, but another prominent commander of that endlessly recycled name, had come to court Syphax at the very same moment. So the two great enemies, the Roman and the Carthaginian, both suitors for the same king's favour, ended up as guests at the same table, in the same hall, dining together under the roof of the man they were both trying to win. Picture the strangeness of it. Syphax, delighted with his own importance, seated these two rivals side by side and enjoyed the spectacle. And Scipio, with that easy, luminous charm that seems to have been as much a weapon as his tactical mind, so impressed the Carthaginian commander across the table that even his enemy came away speaking of him with admiration, remarking that the young Roman was as formidable in a banquet hall as he was said to be on a battlefield. Scipio flattered the vanity of Syphax, dazzled the company, and sailed away, having apparently secured at enormous personal risk the friendship of the more powerful of the two Numidian kings. I say apparently, and I want you to hold on to that word because it will matter enormously. The second prince was younger, hungrier, and far more consequential in the long run, a man whose name you should tuck away carefully tonight, because it will run through the rest of this story like a bright, dangerous thread. His name was Massinissa. He was a Numidian prince who had actually been fighting for Carthage in Spain on the other side, and who had watched Scipio's campaigns up close. Watched the way this Roman returned hostages and freed captives and turned enemies into friends. And somewhere in that watching, Massinissa had begun to wonder if his future lay with the young man rather than against him. There is a lovely quiet tradition about how these two first took each other's measure, because Massinissa's own nephew had been captured by the Romans in Spain, and Scipio, being Scipio, had treated the young man with kindness and sent him home laden with gifts. That gesture, that same patient manufacturing of loyalty, we watched him practice on the Spanish tribes, reached across the sea and lodged in the heart of the Numidian prince. When Massinissa and Scipio finally met, the accounts tell us the prince was already half won, and the meeting only completed what the kindness had begun. Massinissa pledged himself to Scipio, promising that when the Romans came to Africa, his cavalry would ride for Rome. And here is the twist of the knife, the cruel symmetry that fate was setting up while Scipio congratulated himself on his diplomacy. Because Massinissa, this brilliant, loyal young prince, had a bitter personal grievance in Numidia. There was a woman, a Carthaginian noblewoman of legendary beauty named Sophonisba, and there was a rivalry. And there was a kingdom disputed between Massinissa and the very same Syphax whom Scipio had just so charmingly courted. The two Numidian kings were not merely rivals, they were enemies to the death, and they wanted the same throne, and as it happened, the same woman. So Scipio, in his cleverness, had done something that looked brilliant, and was in fact quietly impossible. He had secured the friendship of both Syphax and Massinissa, but those two men could never both be his allies because they could never both survive. In courting the powerful Syphax, he had wooed a man who would soon be pulled by that same Sophonisba back into Carthage's arms. And in winning Massinissa, he had bound himself to Syphax's mortal enemy. One of these alliances was going to shatter, and the question of which one and when would hang over the whole invasion. For now, though, Scipio sailed back toward Spain and then toward Rome, with what looked like a diplomatic triumph in his pocket, two kings courted an African beachhead of loyalty prepared. He had done the impossible again, walking unarmed into hostile lands and coming away with the friendship of the very men who could win him the war. His confidence, that serene, unshakable, faintly divine confidence, must have burned brighter than ever. But confidence, you will remember, has a way of making enemies at home, and the enemies waiting for Scipio in Rome were not Numidian kings or Carthaginian generals. They were his own people. Old, cautious, jealous men who had watched this brilliant young comet streak across the sky and decided in the safety of the Senate House that it was time somebody clipped his wings. The greatest fight of Scipio's life so far was about to take place, not on any battlefield but on the floor of the Roman Senate, against the most respected old man in the Republic. And for a while it looked as though the old man might win. He comes home to Rome a hero, and Rome, being Rome, immediately begins to resent him for it. The people adore him. They elect him consul, the highest office in the Republic, and here again the rules bend around this young man like light around something heavy, because he is still, by the strict traditions of the Roman ladder of offices, really too young to hold it, having leapt several rungs that other men spent decades climbing. But the crowds do not care about the ladder. They care that he took Spain, that he avenged his father, that he seems blessed. They give him the consulship, and Scipio, standing at the summit of Roman ambition at an age when most men are still waiting their turn, immediately announces the plan that has been burning in him since Spain. He does not want to fight Hannibal in Italy. He wants to sail to Africa, land on Carthage's own coast, and threaten the city itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend his home. And the Senate, or a powerful part of it, recoils in something close to horror. At the head of the opposition stands the single most respected man in Rome, an old warrior named Fabius Maximus. And you have to understand who Fabius is, because he is not some petty, jealous nobody. Fabius is a living legend, the man who in the darkest years after Cannae saved Rome by refusing to fight. When Hannibal was rampaging unbeaten through Italy, and every Roman instinct screamed to march out and meet him, Fabius alone had the iron nerve to hold back to shadow Hannibal, to harass and delay and deny him a battle-wearing the invader. Down through patience and time. They mocked Fabius for it, then called him the delayer as an insult, until they realized that his caution was the only thing keeping Rome alive, and then they said the name with reverence. Fabius is caution incarnate. Fabius is the wisdom of survival. And Fabius looks at this brilliant, glittering young man and sees with genuine fear a reckless gambler about to bet the entire republic on a single roll of the dice. The debate between them is one of the great clashes in Roman history, old age against youth, caution against daring, and Fabius argues with all the weight of his years. Why, he demands, would you leave Hannibal still standing on Italian soil, still undefeated, and sail off to Africa, stretching your supply lines across the sea, putting an ocean between your army and any help, gambling everything on foreign allies who may betray you? Finish Hannibal here first, Fabius says. Drive him from Italy before you go dreaming of Carthage. It is, you have to admit, an extremely reasonable argument. It is the argument a sensible person makes. And that, in a way, is precisely what Scipio understands, and Fabius does not, that the sensible war, the grinding, cautious war of attrition could go on for another 15 years, because Hannibal in Italy is a problem that has no solution as long as you keep playing his game on his terms. But there is something else moving beneath the surface of Fabius's caution, and Scipio surely senses it, and it stings. Because Fabius the old delayer has built his entire towering reputation on the idea that Hannibal cannot be beaten in open battle, only worn down over years. And here comes a young man proposing to do the thing Fabius has spent his whole career insisting is too dangerous to attempt, to seek out the decisive battle, to gamble on genius rather than grind on patience. If Scipio succeeds, if he wins the war with one bold African stroke, then Fabius's lifetime of caution starts to look less like wisdom and more like timidity. There is jealousy woven into the old man's fear, the very human resentment of the elder, who suspects the youth might make his whole life's philosophy look small. Historians still debate how much of Fabius's opposition was genuine strategic prudence, and how much was an old lion unwilling to see a young one claim the kill he never dared attempt. And the honest answer is probably that it was both, tangled together in a way even Fabius himself might not have been able to separate. The Senate, swayed by Fabius and by their own nervousness, does something sly. They cannot openly defy the popular young consul and forbid his African plan outright. They assign him the province of Sicily, the stepping stone to Africa, but they refuse to give him an army to invade with. They will not authorize a proper levy of fresh legions. They tell him, in effect, that he may pursue his mad African adventure if he insists, but he will have to do it without the Republic's real support, with whatever scraps he can scrape together. It is a way of saying no, while pretending to say yes, of setting the young man up to fail on his own head, so that when the whole reckless scheme collapses, it will be his ruin and not theirs. And Scipio, faced with this poisoned half-permission, does the thing that defines him. He accepts it, and he turns the poison into fuel. If Rome will not give him an army, he will build one himself. He calls for volunteers, and men come drawn by his name and his luck. Italian towns and allies, eager to please the rising star, contribute soldiers and supplies and ships. He accepts every man who will come, and he sets about forging his gathered volunteers into a fighting force by sheer will and organization. But the real heart of the army he is about to build lies waiting for him in Sicily, and it is made of the most unlikely material imaginable. There are legions stationed there in a kind of permanent disgrace, exiled soldiers whom Rome has cast aside and refuses to bring home. And who are these disgraced men rotting in Sicilian garrison? They are the survivors of Cannae, the very men who lived through that field of horror, whom Rome had punished with permanent exile for the crime of not dying with their comrades. Scipio, who had bled and survived on that same field, was about to go to these broken, shamed, forgotten men and offer them the one thing no one else ever would: a chance at redemption. And the army of ghosts he was about to raise would prove the strangest and most motivated force Rome ever sent to war. Consider what those Cannae survivors have been living with, exiled in Sicily year after year, because it explains everything about the weapon Scipio is about to forge. Rome had not simply lost the Battle of Cannae. Rome had needed someone to blame for it, and the men who survived made convenient scapegoats, as though living through the slaughter were itself a kind of cowardice. So the Senate banished the survivors to Sicily and decreed that they would remain there for the duration of the war, denied the honours, the winter quarters, and the dignity granted to other soldiers a standing reproach, a living monument to Pace, Rome's greatest shame. They had been rotting there for years, these men, carrying a disgrace they did not earn, hungering for nothing so much as the chance to prove that the disaster had not been their fault. And Scipio walks into their exile and hands them exactly that chance. You have to understand why this is such an inspired stroke, and it is pure Scipio, the same instinct that returned the hostages and freed the beautiful captive now applied to an entire army. Other commanders looked at the canny legions and saw damaged goods, tainted men, a garrison of failures. Scipio looked at them and saw the most motivated soldiers in the entire Roman world. Here were men with a burning personal grievance, men desperate to wash away a stain, men who would fight not merely for pay or duty, but for their own redemption, for the right to go home with their heads up. Give men like that a cause and a leader who believes in them, and they will do things that ordinary soldiers cannot. Scipio took these disgraced veterans and, rather than despising them, he embraced them, folded them into the core of his new army, and gave them back their purpose. He trained them relentlessly through the Sicilian months, drilling his gathered volunteers and his redeemed exiles into a single sharp instrument, teaching them the tactics that had broken Carthage in Spain. I want you to hold on to the poetry of this, because it is one of the quiet marvels of the whole story. The survivors of canny Rome's deepest wound, the men who watched Hannibal work his masterpiece, were about to become the very army that would seek out and finally break the Carthaginian power. The disaster and its cure were made of the same men. There is a kind of justice in that, so precise it feels designed. But this stretch of the story is not all triumph, and here we come to the shadow that fell across Scipio's Sicilian preparations, the first serious crack in his golden reputation. And it is worth telling honestly, because Scipio was a man and not a myth. While he was drilling his army, one of his subordinate officers, a man named Flaminius, whom Scipio had left in command of the captured town of Locri in southern Italy, committed a series of appalling crimes. Flaminius and his soldiers plundered the town, savagely robbed a sacred temple of the goddess Persephone, and treated the inhabitants with such brutality that the outrage reached all the way to Rome. It was a genuine scandal, ugly and undeniable. And Scipio's enemies in the Senate, the friends of Fabius, who had never wanted this African adventure in the first place, saw their opening and pounced. Here, they cried, was proof of everything they had warned about. The young man was reckless, negligent, so consumed with his grand schemes and his foreign luxuries that he let his officers rampage and rob temples. A commission was sent from Rome to investigate, and there was serious talk that Scipio might be stripped of his command entirely, that the whole African plan might collapse not on a battlefield but under the weight of a subordinate's crimes and a Senate's jealousy. There was a second charge whispered alongside the first, and it cut at something deeper in the Roman character. Scipio, his enemies said, had gone soft, gone Greek. In Sicily they claimed he was lounging about in Greek dress, attending the gymnasium, going to the theatre, indulging in the sophisticated pleasures of Greek culture, rather than maintaining the stern, austere, unglamorous discipline a proper Roman general was supposed to embody. And you should understand that this was a real and recurring anxiety about Scipio throughout his life, because he genuinely loved Greek learning and Greek culture in an age when many Romans regarded such tastes as decadent and un-Roman. A softening of the hard virtues that had built the Republic. It was a culture war, in its way, and Scipio stood on the wrong side of it for many of the old guard. The investigating commission arrived in Sicily, half expecting to find a lazy, decadent commander presiding over a demoralized rabble. What they found instead stopped the whole scandal in its tracks. Scipio, sensing exactly what was at stake, put on a display. He showed the commissioners his army, and it was magnificent, drilled to a razor's edge, disciplined, superbly equipped, bristling with readiness. He showed them his fleet, his stockpiles, his siege equipment, the entire vast machine of invasion he had assembled from scraps the Senate had refused to fund. The commissioners who had come to clip his wings instead came away dazzled, reporting back that far from being a decadent wastrel, Scipio had built one of the finest armies Rome had ever seen, and that it would be madness to remove him. The scandal was pinned where it belonged on the criminal Flaminius, who was hauled off in chains to a grim end, and Scipio emerged with his command intact and his enemies for the moment silenced. But notice and file it away for later tonight how the pattern is already forming. Even at the height of his brilliance, even as he builds the army that will win the war, the knives are already out at home. The very success that makes him beloved by the people makes him feared and resented by the powerful. For now the danger passes, and Scipio stands at last at the edge of the sea with his redeemed army of ghosts, ready to do the thing all of Rome told him was impossible. He gives the order. The fleet puts to sea hundreds of ships, turning their prows toward Africa, toward the homeland of the enemy, toward Carthage itself. And within a single night of landing on that hostile shore, Scipio is about to unleash something so devastating, so terrible, that the memory of it would make Carthaginian mothers frighten their children for generations. The landing in Africa throws Carthage into a panic it has not felt in living memory, because for all the years of this war the fighting has happened somewhere else, in Italy, in Spain, in Sicily, always on someone else's soil. Now the enemy is here on the African coast, within striking distance of Carthage itself, and the great city that sent Hannibal to burn Italy suddenly understands viscerally what it feels like to have the war arrive at your own door. They scramble to respond, and the response takes a shape that must have made Scipio's heart sink, because it involved the collapse of the very diplomacy he had risked his life to build. Remember Syphax, the powerful Numidian king Scipio had so charmingly courted at that strange shared banquet. The alliance had shattered exactly as the tangled loves and hatreds of Numidia had always threatened it would. Carthage had won Syphax back, and they had done it with the oldest lever in the world, a marriage. They had given Syphax the hand of Sophonisba, that Carthaginian noblewoman of legendary beauty, the very woman bound up in Massinisa's bitter grievance. Bound now by marriage to Carthage, Syphax had turned his powerful cavalry against Rome, and poor Massinissa, Scipio's true and loyal ally, had in the meantime lost most of his own kingdom to Syphax and arrived in the Roman camp not as a mighty king bringing armies, but as a prince in exile with only a small band of horsemen at his back. Scipio's grand alliance had curdled. He had the loyal prince who had lost everything, and against him stood the powerful king who had taken it all. So Scipio found himself pinned near the coast, facing the combined might of a Carthaginian army, and Syphax's Numidian host badly outnumbered his bold invasion, in danger of being strangled before it truly began. Through the winter the two sides watched each other, and Scipio, ever the diplomat, even in a corner, opened peace negotiations with Syphax, sending envoys back and forth to the enemy camps under the guise of seeking terms. But the negotiations were a mask. Here is where you meet Scipio at his most cunning, and it must be said his most ruthless, because the peace talks were never sincere. While his envoys shuttled between the camps discussing terms, Scipio was packing those delegations with his sharpest officers, disguised sometimes as servants and slaves, and their real task was not to negotiate at all. Their task was to memorize the enemy camps, to note how they were built and where the entrances lay, and above all to observe one crucial, fatal detail: that the two enemy camps, the Carthaginian and the Numidian, were built largely of wood and reed and thatch, the light flammable materials of men who did not expect to be attacked. Scipio's spies walked through the enemy's home, smiling and talking peace, and counted the kindling. When he had learned everything he needed, Scipio abruptly broke off the negotiations, as though the talks had simply failed. And then he waited for a moonless night. What happened next was one of the most devastating single strokes in the whole of ancient warfare, and I will tell it plainly because its horror needs no embellishment. In the deep dark, Scipio led his army out in two divisions. One, under Massinissa and a Roman commander, moved silently against the camp of Syphax. The other, led by Scipio himself, moved against the Carthaginian camp nearby. And Scipio's men fell first upon the Numidian camp, and they did not attack the sleeping soldiers directly. They set it on fire. They put torches to the reed and thatch and timber, and in the dry African night the flames leapt from hut to hut faster than any man could run, and the entire Numidian camp became within moments a single roaring sea of fire. The soldiers inside jolted awake, assumed at first that the blaze was an accident, a cooking fire spread, and they stumbled out unarmed and half-dressed to fight the flames rather than an enemy, which meant that when Scipio's soldiers fell upon them in the firelight, they were slaughtered helpless and unarmed among the burning wreckage of their own camp. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing so coldly brilliant and so terrible. The Carthaginians in the neighboring camp were woken by the glow and the screaming, and they too assumed it was an accident, a fire in the Numidian lines. So they too poured out of their camp unarmed, rushing to help their allies fight the blaze. And as they ran toward the flames empty-handed, thinking they were coming to a rescue, Scipio's second division fell upon them and set their camp alight as well, and the same horror unfolded a second time. 2 entire armies, tens of thousands of men destroyed in a single night, most of them never having struck a blow, cut down or burned in the chaos of a catastrophe they did not understand until it was far too late. By the ancient counts, and again you should hold those numbers loosely, tens of thousands died that night, and both enemy armies simply ceased to exist. Syphax and the Carthaginian commander escaped with a handful of survivors, but the host that had pinned Scipio to the coast was gone, turned to ash and corpses under a moonless African sky. It was a masterstroke, and it was merciless, and both of those things are true at once. This is the same man who freed the hostages and returned the beautiful captive her gold, and he is also the man who burned 2 sleeping armies alive under cover of false peace talks. Do not let tonight's story flatten him into a saint. Scipio was a great man, and great men in war are rarely gentle ones, and the mercy and the fire lived in the same person, deployed with the same cold precision each when it served his purpose. Carthage reeled. In a single night the balance of the war in Africa had been shattered. But Carthage was not a small enemy, and a great city does not surrender because of one terrible night. Even now they were scraping together the survivors, recruiting fresh troops, calling in what allies remained hastily, assembling yet another army to throw at the young Roman, burning his way toward their gates. And Syphax, humiliated and enraged, was not finished either. The fire had lit the sky over Africa, but the reckoning on open ground was still to come, and it would decide whether Scipio's invasion ended in triumph or in a lonely death far from home. Carthage refuses to accept the ruin of a single night, and there is something almost admirable in the stubbornness of it, the way a great power simply will not believe that its hour has come. Within weeks, the survivors of the fire, joined by fresh Carthaginian levies, and by Syphax gathering his scattered Numidians and a body of newly hired Celtiberian mercenaries from Spain, assemble yet another army on a broad open plateau, called the Great Plains, some days' march inland from the coast. They mean to face Scipio properly this time in daylight on open ground, where there are no reed huts to burn and no false peace talks to hide behind, just soldiers against soldiers, as war is supposed to be fought. And Scipio, hearing that a new army has gathered, does not wait behind his coastal defences. He marches inland to meet it straight toward the enemy and forces the battle. The 2 armies form up on the plateau, and at first the shape of it looks conventional enough, the lines drawn, the cavalry on the wings, the infantry massed in the centre. But Scipio, of course, does not fight conventional battles, and by now you know to watch for the trick inside the ordinary-looking arrangement. The one part of the Carthaginian army that had any real fight left in it was that block of Celtiberian mercenaries in the centre, tough professional soldiers who had come to Africa for pay, and who, unlike the shaken locals around them, had no home to flee to, and no choice but to stand and fight hard. Scipio opened the battle in the usual way, sending his cavalry with Massinissa's Numidians, prominent among them, against the enemy's mounted wings. And the enemy wings, made up largely of the same beaten men who had run from the fire, did not have the heart for it. They broke almost immediately and fled the field, and suddenly the Carthaginian army had no cavalry and open flanks, exactly the situation any general dreads. But the Celtiberian mercenaries in the centre held firm, a hard, stubborn core standing its ground, even as everything around it dissolved. And here Scipio did the thing that marks him as one of the true innovators of ancient war, a manoeuvre so unusual that soldiers must have marvelled to see it performed on the fly in the middle of a battle at a single commander's word. The Roman legion normally fought in 3 lines, one behind the other, and the natural thing, the thing every general did, was to feed those lines forward one after another straight ahead into the enemy. Scipio instead took his 2nd and 3rd lines, the ones waiting behind his front, and rather than sending them forward, He wheeled them outward and marched them around to strike the isolated Celtiberian bloc from both flanks and from behind. His front line pinned the mercenaries in place, while his rear lines swung around like closing doors and surrounded them entirely. You have seen the shape of this before. Tonight at Illapa, at the Great Plains, it appears again, refined, the encirclement of a pinned enemy centre. And the effect on the Celtiberians was total. Cut off, surrounded with the rest of their army already fled, and no line of retreat, they were annihilated where they stood. They fought to the end, because they had no other option and because professional pride demanded it, and they were destroyed almost to the last man in a shrinking ring of Roman iron. The new Carthaginian army, like the one that burned, ceased to exist. 2 great hosts gone in a matter of weeks. The consequences rippled outward fast. Massinissa and a Roman force peeled off from the main army to chase the fleeing Syphax back into his own kingdom, and there, in a running campaign, they finally ran the humiliated king to ground. Syphax was captured, taken alive. The powerful monarch Scipio had once courted at that shared banquet, now a prisoner in chains. And Massinissa, riding on the momentum of victory, swept into Syphax's capital to reclaim the kingdom and the throne that had been stolen from him. And there in the captured palace unfolds one of the most heartbreaking human moments in the entire war. The tragedy of Sophonisba, and I must tell it because it shows you the terrible collision of love and politics that runs beneath all these battles. Massinissa entered the palace and found Sophonisba, the beautiful Carthaginian noblewoman who had once in another life been promised to him before Carthage married her to Syphax to buy the king's loyalty. She threw herself at his feet and begged him not to hand her over to the Romans, not to let her be dragged through the streets of Rome in a triumph as a captive, pleading that she would rather die than fall into Roman hands. And Massinissa, who had loved her once, and perhaps loved her still, married her on the spot that very day, thinking marriage to a king might place her beyond Rome's reach. But Scipio would not allow it. Sophonisba was a Carthaginian noblewoman, a symbol of the enemy, a woman who had already turned one Numidian king against Rome and might yet turn another. Scipio told Massinissa gently but immovably that she must be surrendered as a prisoner of Rome, and Massinissa, torn between his loyalty to Scipio and his promise to the woman he had just married, found a terrible middle path. He kept his word to her in the only way left to him. He sent her a cup of poison with a message that this was the only wedding gift he could give the freedom from Roman captivity she had begged for. And Sophonisba, they say, received the cup, calmly remarked that she would have died better had she not married so near her death, and drank it, and died a queen rather than a captive. I tell you that story in the quiet of tonight, not to dwell on sorrow, but because it reminds us that behind all the brilliant maneuvers and the burning camps were real people caught and crushed between the grinding wheels of empires. Scipio won his war, but winning it cost other people everything. With Syphax captured and his kingdom given to the loyal Massinissa and 2 Carthaginian armies destroyed, the road to Carthage lay open, and the great city at last began to feel the cold breath of true panic. And in their terror the Carthaginians did the one thing they had sworn for 15 years they would never have to do. For 15 years Hannibal has been a wolf loose in Italy, and here is the astonishing, almost unbelievable fact at the centre of it all, the thing that makes his story one of the strangest in military history. In all those years on Italian soil, marching up and down the length of the peninsula, fighting battle after battle against the best generals Rome could send, Hannibal was never once defeated. Not once. He won at Trebia, he won at Lake Trasimene, he annihilated a Roman army at Cannae, and then cut off from home, starved of reinforcements by the very Spanish campaign we followed tonight, denied a decisive victory by the patient shadow war of old Fabius. He simply endured, holding out in the south of Italy, an undefeated general slowly running out of everything an army needs, except his own genius and the loyalty of the veterans who had followed him over the Alps as young men and were now growing grey at his side. Rome had spent those 15 years unable to beat him and unable to make him leave. And now, at last, Scipio had found the answer to the riddle that had baffled the entire republic. You could not beat Hannibal in Italy, so you did not try. Instead, you threatened the one thing Hannibal could not ignore. You put a knife to the throat of Carthage itself. Picture the scene in Carthage as the news of the Great Plains arrives, as the reports come in of 2 armies destroyed of Syphax, captured of the loyal Massinissa, now a Roman ally, ruling a united Numidia of Roman troops ranging almost up to the city walls. The panic in that great trading city, so long insulated from the war it had started, must have been absolute. And the Carthaginian Senate, in its desperation, reaches at last for the only card it has left, the card it had prayed it would never need to play. Come home. Carthage is in danger. Come home and save us. I want you to feel the weight of that summons, because it is one of the great bitter moments in the life of Hannibal, and it tells you everything about what Scipio had accomplished with his invasion. For 15 years Hannibal had dreamed of taking Rome. He had come so close after Cannae, when the road to the city lay nearly open, and now undefeated, still dangerous, still the most feared man alive. He was being recalled like a scolded servant ordered to abandon the Italian soil he had fought over for half a lifetime, to give up the war he had never lost, and to sail home to defend the city he had left. A young man, and might now watch burn. There is a tradition that when Hannibal received the order to withdraw, he ground his teeth and groaned aloud, and cursed, and could barely bring himself to obey, because he understood with perfect clarity that in leaving Italy undefeated, he was in a sense admitting that the whole magnificent murderous adventure had failed. He had won every battle, and was losing the war, and he knew it, and the knowledge must have been like ashes in his mouth. There is a poignant detail the ancient writers preserved, and it is worth pausing on. Before he left Italy for the last time, Hannibal is said to have withdrawn to a temple and set down on bronze tablets a record of his own campaigns, an account of his deeds carved in 3 languages, as though the great man wanted to make certain that whatever happened next, whatever the gods and this young Roman had in store for him, the record of what he had achieved on Italian soil would not be lost. A man carving his own legacy in metal because he senses the story is about to slip out of his hands. And then he gathered his veterans, the hardcore who had crossed the Alps with him and survived 15 years of war, and he loaded them onto ships, and he sailed away from Italy forever, back toward the Africa he had not seen since boyhood, carried home not by triumph, but by the strategy of a young man who had turned his own methods against him. And now, at last, the whole long story tonight bends toward the collision it has been building toward from the very first misty morning at Ticinus. Because think of it, Scipio as a boy had watched Hannibal's cavalry unmake his father's army. Scipio as a young man had survived Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae, had crawled out of that box of death and sworn Rome would not fall. And in all the years since, Scipio had never once faced Hannibal directly. He had beaten Hannibal's brothers, beaten his generals, conquered his provinces, burned his allies, but the 2 greatest soldiers of the age, the master and the student, who had studied him from afar, had never stood on the same battlefield. They had been circling each other for 15 years across 2 continents without ever meeting, and now at last both of them were in Africa, each at the head of an army, each carrying the fate of a civilization on his shoulders, and there was no longer any way for them to avoid each other. The Roman student who had spent his whole life learning from the Carthaginian master was finally going to face his teacher. And the strangest, most human part of what came next is that before they fought, before the elephants charged and the lines crashed together, these 2 men who between them had reshaped the entire Mediterranean world agreed to meet. Alone, face to face, to talk. 2 living legends, the undefeated invader and the man who had never lost, standing together on an African plain, with their armies watching from a distance, each looking at last into the eyes of the only rival worthy of him. What passed between them in that meeting, and why the older man's offer of peace was refused by the younger, is one of the most extraordinary conversations history ever recorded. They meet on a plain, the 2 armies drawn up in the distance, behind each of them close enough to see their commanders but too far to hear a word, and the 2 men walk out toward each other with only an interpreter apiece. And then the tradition tells us something happens that stops even history in its tracks. The 2 greatest generals of the age come face to face, and for a long moment neither of them speaks. They simply stand there looking at each other, each struck silent by the sheer presence of the other, by the strangeness of finally seeing up close the mind that had shadowed his entire life. Hannibal, the older man, the undefeated invader, now nearly 50, weathered by a lifetime of war. One eye long since lost to that infection in the Italian marshes. Scipio, the younger in his early 30s, the student who had spent his whole life studying this man from a distance and now stood an arm's length away. Two men who had never met and knew each other better than almost anyone alive. The silence between them, the writers say, was full of a kind of mutual awe. Hannibal speaks first, and he does something remarkable. He asks for peace. You have to understand what an extraordinary thing this is, and how much it must have cost the proud old lion to say it. Hannibal, who had crossed the Alps, who had won at Cannae, who had held Italy in terror for 15 years, now stands before this young Roman and in effect sues for terms. He delivers a speech that the ancient historians preserved with obvious relish, and it is a masterpiece of a certain kind of hard-won wisdom. Hannibal talks about the turning of fortune, about how he of all men knows how quickly the wheel can spin, how the same Hannibal who once stood at the gates of Rome now stands begging for peace on African soil. He warns Scipio, one great man to another, against trusting too much in his current good fortune, because fortune is fickle, and the greater your success, the further you have to fall. He points to his own career as the living proof of it. Look at me, he is saying. I was where you are now. I had everything. Learn from what became of me. Take the peace, secure your victory, and do not gamble a certain triumph against the treachery of fate. It is a genuinely wise speech, and there is something moving in it. This aging genius offering the young man the hardest lesson of his life as a kind of gift or a warning, or perhaps a plea dressed up as counsel. And the terms Hannibal offers are not unreasonable. Carthage would give up Spain, give up the islands, essentially concede everything it had fought the war to gain, and Rome would win without the risk of one final battle against Hannibal himself. And Scipio says no. Here you have to sit with the courage and the coldness of that refusal, both because it is one of the defining choices of his life. Scipio listens to the greatest general in the world offer him a bloodless victory, and he turns it down. And his reasons when he answers are as clear-eyed as Hannibal's warning. He points out that Carthage had already broken faith once, had already agreed to terms with Rome during the winter, and then torn them up the moment Hannibal's return gave them fresh hope. Why, Scipio asks, should he trust a peace now, when the only thing that has changed is that Hannibal has arrived? A peace signed today would simply be discarded the moment the Carthaginians thought they had the advantage again. And beneath that stated reason lies a harder one. The truth that Scipio, who had spent his whole life circling this man, understood that the war would never truly end, that Carthage would never truly be beaten, so long as Hannibal and his army stood undefeated in the field. The problem was not the terms. The problem was that as long as Hannibal had never lost a battle, the legend of his invincibility would poison every peace. It had to end. Not on paper, on the field. The student had to beat the master decisively in the open, or the beating would never be believed, least of all by Carthage. So the two men, having taken each other's measure at last, having exchanged this strange courtesy of respect and refusal, turned and walked back to their armies. The conference had failed, as perhaps both of them had known it would. And yet something had passed between them there, on that plain, some current of recognition that would outlast the battle to come. For the rest of his life, Scipio would speak of Hannibal with unmistakable admiration, and Hannibal in turn would return the compliment in a story that historians still love to tell. Years later, the two men are said to have met once more in peacetime, and Scipio asked Hannibal who he considered the greatest general of all time. Hannibal named Alexander the Great first, then a second commander, and then himself third. And Scipio, amused, pressed him. Where would you rank yourself, Hannibal, if you had beaten me? And Hannibal replied that in that case he would have placed himself above Alexander, above all of them first of all. It was, the story goes, a sly and graceful way of paying Scipio the highest compliment of all, ranking the man who beat him so high that beating him would have made Hannibal the greatest of all time. Whether the exchange truly happened, no one can say for certain, but it has the ring of truth about two men who understood each other completely. But all of that lies in the future, in a peace not yet won. For now there is only the plain and the two armies and the morning that is coming. The talking is done. Everything Scipio has done since he was a boy at Ticinus, everything Hannibal has done since he crossed the Alps, all of it has narrowed down to this single field, and this single day. Tomorrow, near a town called Zama, the master and the student will finally settle in blood and dust, which of them the world will remember as the greater. And the battle would turn on a trick played with the very weapon Carthage trusted most. The morning comes and the two armies form up on the plain near Zama, and for the first and only time in their lives, Hannibal and Scipio look across a battlefield at each other as opposing commanders. Take a moment to appreciate the sheer improbability of it, the way the whole long war had bent every road toward this single field. And appreciate, too, that the two armies were oddly mismatched in their strengths, in a way that reversed everything the war had taught. For 15 years, Carthage had won on the strength of its cavalry, and Rome had ground forward on the strength of its infantry. But here at Zama the tables were turned. Because Scipio had won over Massinissa and the Numidians, it was now the Romans who had the superior cavalry. And Hannibal, the man who had built his legend on horsemen, found himself outmatched precisely where he had always been strongest. Hannibal's answer to this weakness, his great hope for the day, stood in a long line at the front of his army. Elephants, 80 of them by the ancient count. A wall of war elephants meant to smash the Roman line apart before the cavalry imbalance could decide anything. Scipio knew the elephants were coming, and he had thought carefully about how to beat them, and the solution he devised is a small masterpiece of battlefield cleverness. The Roman legion normally arranged its units in a checkerboard pattern, with gaps between them that were staggered so that the second line covered the gaps in the first. A formation designed to prevent an enemy from finding a straight path through. Scipio ordered his men to do something different. He arranged his units so that the gaps lined up front to back, creating clear lanes straight through the entire depth of his army. He hid these lanes, filling the front of them with light skirmishers so that to Hannibal's eye the Roman line looked solid and normal. But those lanes were a trap laid specifically for the elephants. The battle opened with the elephant charge, that terrifying wall of grey bulk thundering across the plain toward the Roman line, and here Scipio's preparation paid off in two ways at once. His men raised a tremendous din, blowing horns and trumpets and shouting a wall of noise designed to panic the animals, because an elephant is a magnificent weapon right up until it becomes frightened, at which point it becomes a catastrophe for whoever happens to be nearest friend or foe. Some of the elephants panicked at the noise and bolted sideways into Hannibal's own cavalry on the wings, throwing his horsemen into disorder at the worst possible moment. The elephants that kept coming straight ahead charged into the Roman line and found, instead of a solid wall of men to trample, those open lanes deliberately left for them. The animals, following the path of least resistance, the way frightened animals do, funneled straight down the empty lanes, running harmlessly through the gaps in the Roman formation where skirmishers on either side peppered them with javelins and drove them out the back of the army or off the field entirely. The great elephant charge, Hannibal's best hope of the day, was neutralized almost completely by a man who had simply thought harder about the problem. With the elephants spent and the disorder they caused on his wings, Hannibal's cavalry was quickly overwhelmed by the superior Roman and Numidian horse, which drove his horsemen from the field in a wild pursuit. And now the battle came down to what Hannibal had perhaps always known it would, a straight, grinding, brutal contest of infantry, line against line in the center of the plain. And here the old master showed why he was Hannibal. He had arranged his infantry in 3 lines of increasing quality, and he fed them forward with terrible skill, each line grinding at the Romans, wearing them down, so that the battle in the center became a savage, static slaughter neither side, giving way the finest infantry of both nations locked in a killing embrace under the African sun. Hannibal's veterans, the hard men who had followed him from Italy, held in the rear, fresh and deadly, and for a long, agonizing stretch. The outcome hung genuinely in the balance, and it was not at all certain that the young Roman would win. What decided it in the end was the very thing that had haunted this war from the beginning, from the misty morning at Ticinus where we started. Cavalry. Remember that the Roman and Numidian horse had chased Hannibal's cavalry off the field early in the battle. Now at the critical moment, as the infantry lines ground against each other in exhausted deadlock, that victorious Roman cavalry came thundering back onto the battlefield, having finished their pursuit, and they crashed into the rear of Hannibal's infantry. It was in a terrible irony the exact maneuver that had destroyed the Romans at Cannae, the hammer of cavalry falling on the back of a pinned infantry line, sealing the trap, turning a battle into an annihilation. The student had at the last beaten the master with the master's own masterpiece delivered in reverse. Hannibal's army, struck in the rear, collapsed. The great host that had come to save Carthage was destroyed on the plain of Zama, and Hannibal himself, seeing the day was irretrievably lost, did the only sensible thing left to a great general and escaped the field with a handful of Carth survivors to preserve himself for whatever came next. He had lost at last the first defeat of his entire career, and it had come at the hands of the young man who had studied him his whole life. And so the thing that had seemed impossible for a generation was finally accomplished. Hannibal the unbeaten, the terror of Rome, the man who had crossed the Alps and shattered army after army, had been beaten, not worn down, not delayed, not avoided, but beaten decisively in open battle by a Roman. The spell of his invincibility, which had hung over the entire war and poisoned every attempt at peace, was broken at last. Scipio stood victorious on the field, master now of the Mediterranean world, and yet the story of what that victory would cost him back home in the city he had saved was only just beginning. First, though, there was a war to end and a name to be won, a name that would echo down all the centuries to come. With Hannibal beaten and his army destroyed, Carthage had nothing left to fight with. And this time the peace was real, because this time there was no hidden army, no returning genius, no fresh hope to tempt the Carthaginians into tearing up the terms. And here, in the moment of total victory, Scipio revealed once more the quality that had always set him apart. Because he did not do what a lesser and angrier conqueror might have done. He had the power now to raze Carthage to the ground, to erase the city that had sent Hannibal to burn Italy and had cost Rome a generation of blood, and there were surely voices urging him to do exactly that. Scipio refused. He believed and argued that a defeated but surviving Carthage, stripped of its power but allowed to live, was better for Rome than a smoking ruin that would only breed undying hatred. It was the same instinct that had returned the hostages and freed the captive bride Mercy, deployed as strategy, the long view over the short satisfaction of revenge. But make no mistake, the terms he imposed were crushing, designed to break Carthage as a military power forever, while leaving it alive as a trading city. Carthage had to give up all its territories outside Africa, everything it had fought the whole war to hold. It had to surrender almost its entire navy, and there is a haunting image the ancient writers preserved of the Carthaginian warships, 500 of them being towed out into the bay and burned, the smoke of a burning fleet rising over the harbour as the people of Carthage watched their power turn to ash on the water. Carthage had to surrender its war elephants. It had to pay an enormous indemnity in silver stretched out over 50 years, a debt that would bind the city in humiliation for 2 generations. And, in the cruelest clause of all, for a proud independent power, Carthage was forbidden from ever making war again, anywhere without Rome's permission, reducing the once great rival to a subject in all but name. There is one more provision worth pausing on, because it would echo forward in a way no one at Zama could foresee. Carthage was left hemmed in, forbidden to defend itself even against its neighbours without Roman leave. And the chief neighbour now was Massinissa, Scipio's loyal Numidian ally, sitting on a united and Roman-backed kingdom right on Carthage's border. In the decades to come, Massinissa would nibble and raid and provoke at Carthage's edges, and Carthage, forbidden to strike back, would suffer it until at last the provocation drove them to break the treaty and fight. And that broken treaty would give Rome the excuse to return and finally do the thing Scipio had chosen, not to do and wipe Carthage from the earth entirely. But that final horror lay more than 50 years in the future, long after Scipio himself was gone, and it is not our story tonight. Tonight Carthage lives humbled and disarmed, and the long war is over. Scipio sailed home to Rome, and the city that had once doubted him, that had refused to fund his invasion, that had sent commissioners to investigate and depose him, now threw open its gates to welcome home the greatest hero it had ever produced. He was granted a triumph, the highest honour Rome could bestow, the great ceremonial procession through the streets of the city, and it must have been a spectacle to remember the captured treasure and the prisoners and the soldiers of the army of ghosts, the canny survivors, marching at last through Rome, not in disgrace but in glory, redeemed exactly as their commander had promised. And Syphax, the captured Numidian king, may have walked in that procession or one like it. The powerful monarch Scipio had once charmed at a shared banquet, now paraded through the streets as a trophy of the war, a reminder of how far the wheel of fortune could turn, exactly as Hannibal had warned. And it was here in the aftermath of the greatest victory in Roman history that Scipio received the name by which the world would remember him ever after. For it was the custom of Rome to award a victorious general a surname drawn from the enemy he had conquered, a permanent honorific carved into his identity and passed down to his descendants. And so Publius Cornelius Scipio, the boy who had ridden into the mist at Ticinus, the young man who had survived Cannae and sworn Rome, would not fall the volunteer who had walked into the graveyard, command in Spain the general who had burned 2 armies in a night, beaten the unbeatable Hannibal at Zama, was given the name of the nation he had brought to its knees. He became Scipio Africanus, Scipio of Africa, the conqueror of the continent, the man who had done what no Roman before him had ever managed, carrying the name of his greatest triumph for all time. Think of what he was in that moment. He was perhaps 35 years old. He had ended the most dangerous war in his nation's history. He had defeated the most feared general the world had ever seen. He was the most famous, most admired, most beloved man in the entire Roman world, wrapped in an aura of near-divine favor, hailed by his soldiers as unbeatable, adored by the people, garlanded with a name that would outlast empires. By any measure a human life can be measured, he stood at the absolute summit of everything a man could achieve. He had quite literally saved Rome. And here is the bitter, aching truth at the heart of tonight's story, the thing that makes it not a simple tale of triumph, but something deeper and sadder and more human. That summit was the beginning of his fall. Because Rome, you see, had a long and jealous history with men who became too great. Men whose glory outshone the Republic itself, and the very qualities that made Scipio magnificent. The brilliance, the fame, the near-kingly aura, the adoration of the crowds were precisely the qualities that made the guardians of Roman liberty deeply, coldly afraid. The knives that had flashed briefly during the Sicilian scandal had never really been put away. They had only been waiting. And now, with the war won, and Scipio's usefulness spent, the men who feared what he had become began, quietly, patiently, to sharpen them again. To understand what happened to Scipio in the years after his triumph, you have to understand something deep in the Roman character, a fear that ran through the Republic like a fault line through rock. Rome had been founded in its own telling on the expulsion of a king, and it had built its entire political identity around a single terror. The terror of any one man rising so high above his fellow citizens that he might become a king, in fact if not in name. The Republic was a machine of shared power of offices held for a single year, and then surrendered of colleagues checking colleagues, all of it designed to ensure that no individual ever became indispensable, ever became greater than the state itself. And here was Scipio Africanus, a man who had more or less single-handedly saved that state, a man so beloved that crowds followed him through the streets, so admired that his name was spoken with reverence, a man wrapped in an aura of divine favor he had spent his whole life cultivating. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man the Republic had been built to fear. For a while the fear stayed quiet, buried under the sheer gratitude of a nation that owed him everything. But gratitude is a currency that spends fast, and there was one man in Rome who was constitutionally incapable of feeling it, and he would become Scipio's great nemesis in these later years. His name was Marcus Porcius Cato, and he is one of the most formidable and least lovable figures in all of Roman history. Cato was in almost every way Scipio's opposite, and the two men detested each other. Where Scipio was elegant, cultured, a lover of Greek philosophy and art and refined living, Cato was harsh, austere, aggressively old-fashioned, a farmer's son who prided himself on his rough simplicity and despised everything he saw as soft or foreign or luxurious. Cato had actually served under Scipio in Sicily, and he had been one of the voices complaining about the general's Greek dress and Greek habits and lavish spending, one of the men muttering that Scipio had gone soft and un-Roman. To Cato, Scipio represented everything that was going wrong with Rome, the creeping corruption of foreign luxury, the dangerous elevation of one glittering individual above the stern collective virtue that Cato believed had made Rome great. Cato was suspicious of Scipio's fame, suspicious of his spending, suspicious of his easy grandeur, and above all suspicious of what such a man might do with such power. And Cato was patient and relentless, and utterly without fear. He was not alone. Around him gathered a faction of senators who shared his anxieties, some out of genuine principle, some out of simpler motives, the plain jealousy of smaller men watching a greater one, and longing to bring him down to their own level. And in the years after Zama, this faction began slowly and carefully to move against Scipio and his family. They could not attack him openly for his victory, of course. You cannot easily prosecute a man for saving the Republic. So they did what jealous factions have always done. They looked for a weakness, an opening, a technicality, a scandal, anything that could be used to tarnish the golden name and cut the great man down to size. And they found their opening not in Africa but in the East, years later, in a new war against a new enemy. For Scipio's story was not quite done as a soldier. When Rome went to war against Antiochus, the powerful king of the Seleucid Empire in the East, Scipio Africanus went along, though, in a curious arrangement that tells you something about the constraints already tightening around him. The formal command was given to his younger brother Lucius Scipio, while Africanus himself served as his brother's lieutenant, the real strategic mind behind a nominally junior role. And there is a poignant footnote to this Eastern war because the enemy king Antiochus had a distinguished military advisor in his court, an exile who had fled his own ruined city and sold his talents to a foreign monarch. That advisor was Hannibal. So the two old rivals were in a sense on opposite sides once more, the beaten Carthaginian genius now advising Rome's new enemy, though the sources suggest Antiochus never really trusted Hannibal enough to use him properly, and the two great generals never faced each other on a battlefield again. The Romans won the war against Antiochus decisively, and the Scipio brothers returned home victorious once more. Lucius even taking the surname Asiaticus in imitation of his brother's African honor. By any reasonable measure, the family stood higher than ever, two brothers, two great victories, the conquerors of Africa and Asia both. But that very height was the problem. To Cato and his faction, the Scipios were becoming insufferable, a family behaving almost like royalty, accumulating glory and influence beyond what any citizens of a republic should hold. The victory in the East, rather than securing the family's position, simply gave their enemies fresh ground to attack, because with the war came money, vast sums of it, indemnities and tribute, and the spoils of a rich Eastern kingdom. And where there is money changing hands in enormous quantities, there is always the opportunity to whisper the word corruption. So the knives came out at last, no longer whispering but striking in the open. Cato's faction launched a legal assault on the Scipio family, and it was aimed with cold precision at the money from the Eastern War. They demanded an accounting. Where, they asked, was all the treasure taken from Antiochus? What had happened to the enormous sums that had passed through the hands of the Scipio brothers? Had it all been properly delivered to the Roman treasury, or had some of it perhaps stuck to the fingers of the family that handled it? It was a devastating line of attack because it did not require proving that Scipio was a bad general or a traitor. It only required raising a cloud of suspicion around money, and money is the easiest thing in the world to make a great man look guilty about. The prosecutions that followed would drag the greatest hero in Roman history into a courtroom to answer to the very people he had saved. And what Scipio did when they tried to put him on trial would become one of the most famous acts of defiance in all of Roman history. The attack came in stages, the way these things do, testing the ground, probing for weakness before the main assault. First, they went after the brother Lucius, the nominal commander in the Eastern War, demanding that he account for the money that had passed through his hands, hauling him before the authorities to explain what had become of the treasure of Antiochus. And the accusation was not merely embarrassing, it was dangerous, carrying the threat of ruinous fines and public disgrace, potentially even imprisonment. The Scipio family, the conquerors of two continents, found themselves cornered in a Roman courtroom, forced onto the defensive by men who could never have dreamed of matching their achievements on any battlefield. What happened next is one of the great scenes in Roman history, and it shows you Scipio Africanus in a new light, no longer the patient calculating strategist, but a proud man pushed to the edge of his endurance, responding to insult with a defiance so magnificent and so reckless that it takes the breath away. When Lucius was ordered to produce his account books, To lay out the financial records that would prove his innocence or his guilt, Scipio Africanus rose. He took the account books from his brother's hands, the very documents his accusers were demanding, to examine the evidence that would settle the whole affair. And in front of the entire Senate, in front of his accusers, he tore them to pieces with his own hands. Think of the sheer towering arrogance and the wounded pride wrapped together in that gesture. He was destroying the evidence, yes, but not to hide guilt, quite the opposite. He was making a statement that thundered louder than any speech. He was saying, in effect, that it was beneath the dignity of the man who had brought hundreds of millions into the Roman treasury to be quibbled at over a few coins, that for the family that had saved Rome to be asked to justify itself over money was an obscenity, an empire, insult so gross that he would not dignify it by cooperating. "How dare you," the gesture said. "How dare you, of all people, ask me, of all people, to account for myself like a common thief?" He would rather destroy the proof of his own innocence than submit to the humiliation of being asked to provide it. It was not the act of a guilty man. It was the act of a proud one, mortally offended, who had decided that his word and his deeds were account enough, and that Rome could take them or leave them. And then when they came for him directly, when the prosecution turned at last from the brother to the great man himself, and summoned Scipio Africanus to stand trial before the people, he delivered the masterstroke of defiance, the moment that Romans would retell for centuries. It happened that the day appointed for his trial, the day he was to stand before the assembly and answer the charges against him, fell on the anniversary of the Battle of Zama, the very day, years before, on which he had defeated Hannibal and saved Rome from Carthage. Scipio came to the trial. But he did not come to defend himself. He came instead and reminded the assembled people what day it was. He told them that on this very day, this exact anniversary, he had met Hannibal in Africa and conquered him and won the war that had preserved their city and their freedom and their lives. And then, rather than answering a single one of the charges, rather than lowering himself to plead his innocence, he turned to the crowd and declared that it seemed only right on such a sacred day to go up to the temple and give thanks to the gods for that great victory. And he simply turned and walked away from his own trial up toward the Capitoline Hill to offer his thanks to Jupiter, the god who men had always whispered guided his steps. And here is the astonishing part, the part that reveals just how deep the love and the awe for this man still ran in the ordinary people of Rome. The crowd followed him. The entire assembly, the very people who had been convened to sit in judgment upon him, rose up and abandoned the trial and streamed after him up the hill, leaving his accusers standing alone in an empty forum, prosecuting a man who was no longer there and whose jury had walked out to worship at his side. It was a triumph of pure charisma over cold law, the people of Rome choosing in that moment their gratitude to their savior over the accusations of his enemies. Scipio had turned his own trial into a victory procession. He had reminded Rome exactly who he was, and Rome, for one last glorious afternoon, remembered. It was the grandest gesture of his life, and it was also in a way the beginning of his end, because you cannot humiliate the institutions of a republic like that, cannot tear up account books and walk out of trials and lead the jury away without confirming every single fear your enemies have ever harbored about you. In that magnificent act of defiance, Scipio proved Cato's entire case. He showed that he considered himself above the law, above the Senate, above the ordinary processes that governed ordinary citizens. He showed that he was in his person and his popularity a threat to the very idea of the Republic, a man so great that the normal rules simply bent around him. He won the day. But in winning it, he demonstrated precisely why men like Cato believed he had to be brought down, and he handed them in his moment of triumph the final proof they needed. The prosecutions did not stop. They ground on relentlessly, and though Scipio himself was never actually convicted and never dragged to a formal punishment, the endless assault took its toll on a proud man's spirit in a way no battle ever had. There is something crueler about being worn down by ingratitude at home than by any enemy in the field. Hannibal had never broken him. Cannae had never broken him. The graveyard command in Spain had never broken him. But the slow, petty, relentless pecking of jealous men in the city he had saved, the endless insinuations, the courtroom summons, The sheer bottomless ingratitude of it began at last to do what no enemy had ever managed. It began to break Scipio's heart, and so the greatest man in Rome made a decision that would end his story in bitterness and in a kind of exile from the very people he had given everything to save. He left Rome. That is the quiet, devastating end of it. The man who had saved the city, who had defeated Hannibal, who had carried the name of a conquered continent, grew so weary and so wounded by the endless ingratitude of his countrymen that he simply withdrew from the city altogether. He retired to a country estate at a place called Liternum on the coast of Campania, a modest villa by the sea, far from the Forum and the Senate and the crowds who had once adored him and then allowed his enemies to hound him. And there he lived out his final years in a kind of self-imposed exile, a voluntary banishment from public life, turning his back on the republic that had turned its back on him. Picture him there in those last quiet years, this man who had stood at the very summit of the world. The house at Liternum was not grand by the accounts that survive a simple working farm by the water, and there is a tradition that Scipio, who had once loved Greek luxury and elegant living, spent his final days tending the land with his own hands, a great man grown deliberately small, a conqueror become a farmer, watching the sea and letting the noise of Rome fade into the distance behind him. Whether he found peace there, or only a quieter kind of grief, no one can truly say. But the bitterness never entirely left him, and it found its final, unforgettable expression in the instructions he left for his own death. For Scipio, Africanus gave orders that when he died he was not to be buried in Rome. He who had saved the city, who by every right should have been laid to rest among its greatest heroes, in the tombs of his ancestors, honoured by the state he had preserved, refused it. He commanded that his body remain at Liternum in the earth of his country exile, and that a bitter epitaph be carved for him. The words that tradition assigns to his tomb are among the most wounding ever spoken by a great man to his own people. "Ungrateful fatherland," the epitaph read, "you shall not even have my bones." Sit with that a moment tonight, the terrible sadness folded into those few words. "Ungrateful fatherland, you shall not even have my bones." Here was the man who had given Rome everything, his youth, his family's blood, his genius, his whole life bent toward the single purpose of saving the Republic, and this was his final verdict upon it. Not triumph, not gratitude, just the quiet, unhealing wound of a man who had loved his country far more than his country had loved him, and who chose in the end to deny it even the honor of his grave. He died around the age of 52, not on a battlefield, not at the hands of any enemy, but in obscurity by the sea, worn out by disappointment in the same year, by a strange twist of fate that his old rival Hannibal also died in exile, hunted at last to his own bitter end in a foreign land. The two great enemies who had shaped the entire age between them left the world at nearly the same moment. Both of them exiles, both of them cast out by ingratitude, the Carthaginian hunted by Rome and the Roman driven out by his own kind. There is a symmetry to it so perfect and so sad that it hardly seems like history at all. And here is the thought I want to leave you with before we let the story go for the night. Scipio Africanus won every war he ever fought. He was never once beaten on a battlefield, not by Hannibal, not by anyone. He was arguably the most successful general Rome ever produced, and one of the greatest in the entire history of the world. And it was not enough to save him. Not from the jealousy of smaller men, not from the fear of a republic that could not tolerate anyone greater than itself, not from the slow poison of ingratitude. The lesson old Hannibal had tried to give him on that plain before Zama, the warning about the turning of fortune's wheel, about how the highest are always the closest to the fall, turned out to be truer than either of them could have known. Both of them learned it. Both of them ended the same way, and now gently let us leave them there. Let the plain of Zama grow quiet in your mind, the dust settling at last over the field where the elephants charged and the two greatest generals of the age met and parted. Let the smoke of the burning fleets drift away over a calm and darkening sea until the water lies smooth and black and still beneath the first faint stars. The armies have all gone home now, or gone to their rest. The shouting long since faded, the trumpets silent, the great fear that hung over the world for a generation dissolved into the soft hush of a night 2,000 years past. Somewhere on a quiet coast, an old man sits by the water in the fading light, and the anger has drained out of him at last, and there is only the sound of the waves, patient and endless, folding gently onto the shore. the same waves that were folding there long before he was born and would go on folding long after he was gone. Feel how far away it all is now, how safely the centuries have carried it into the past, where nothing can trouble it anymore and nothing more can be lost. The old rivalries are at peace. The old wounds have healed into the quiet of history. Hannibal and Scipio have laid down their long quarrel, and the sea that carried their fleets lies still and dark and calm. There is nothing left for you to hold, nothing left to fear, nothing left to do, but let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow soft and heavy like the last light leaving the water. The stars are dimming now. The tide has gone still. The world is quiet, and the long war is over, and everything that once burned so fiercely has faded into gentle darkness. You are safe, and you are warm, and the night is deep, and it is time now to let it all go and drift and sleep.